It gives me enormous pleasure to introduce our next keynote speaker, Peter van Inwagen. He's the John Cardinal O'Hara Professor of Philosophy Emeritus at the University of Notre Dame in the States, and also a research professor of philosophy at Duke University, depending on whether you speak with a British pronunciation as I do or American. Okay, so I'm going to say Duke because I'm British, but I know it should be pronounced Duke. While he works in a wide variety of areas, much of his work has been in metaphysics, the philosophy of action, and the philosophy of religion. He moved to Notre Dame from Syracuse in 1995 and was elected a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in 2005. Van Inwagen's 1983 monograph, An Essay on Free Will, made an indubitably significant contribution to opening up discussions about free will in mainstream analytical philosophy by drawing attention to the role that incompatibilism could play as an option for characterizing the relationship between free will and determinism. Subsequently, in his 1990 book, Material Beings, Van Inwagen set out to examine the metaphysics of material composition, arguing controversially that all material objects are either elementary particles or living organisms. His treatment of that topic helped define many of the key terms employed in metaphysical discourse over subsequent decades. In 2003, he gave the Gifford Lectures, published 3 years later as The Problem of Evil, in which he sought to address so-called arguments from evil. That is to say, arguments against the existence of God that appeal to facts about evil. Recent writings have addressed a variety of topics in metaphysics and philosophical theology, including the question of human resurrection after death. Van Inwagen's widely acclaimed introduction to metaphysics, entitled Metaphysics, was re-released last year by Routledge in its 5th edition, something that testifies to the continuing influence and relevance of his ideas, especially where analytically oriented metaphysics is concerned. So, without more ado, I'd like to invite Professor Inwagen to give his lecture right now. Professor Inwagen, the lecture is entitled Naturalism. Professor Inwagen.
Well, thank you very much for the kind introduction. I say Duke myself, but I wish to begin by thanking the organizers of this conference for honoring me by inviting me to be one of its speakers. I do regret that the infirmities of age have prevented me from attending in person. Now, there is a handout. If you don't have it, it's of no great consequence, but it would help with a couple of the rougher technical passages in the paper. But if you don't grasp the rougher technical passages, that's of no consequence either. But there are a couple of corrections I'd like to make to the handout. They're both on the second page. That's the page that has the words "an obvious consequence of naturalism" at the top of the page. If you look down, you'll see toward the bottom, two bullet-pointed sentences. And right above those, a little patch that begins "an uncentered supernatural." Insert the word "being" after supernatural there. And as for the two bullet-pointed sentences, eliminate the bullet point from the first. That shouldn't have been bullet-pointed. That is the sentence that begins "two theses of the philosophy of language." That should not have been bullet-pointed. And the patch that follows the second one, the one that begins "certain natural language words and phrases," that should have been bullet-pointed. Bullet point between "certain natural language words and phrases." I hope that's clear. But if it isn't, the third time, it's of no consequence. Okay. Now, the word naturalism obviously has something to do with nature. There can, I think, be no objection to saying that a naturalist is someone who says that there is nothing besides nature, nothing in addition to nature, nothing outside or beyond or above nature. There's no objection, but it's not a very informative thing to say. For what is this nature, besides which, if the naturalists are right, there is nothing? The etymologies of the words natura and physis are connected with the ideas of birth and growth, and this root meaning is preserved in the usual understanding of the English word nature by most people. As most people use the word nature, nature is something that is mostly green. Indeed, in its primary sense, the word naturalist applies not to a person who holds a certain philosophical position, but to a person who knows all about birds and trees and wild flowers. But if naturalism is the thesis that there is nothing besides nature, the word nature must be understood as denoting something that is not mostly green, but is mostly black. I owe the nature as mostly green, nature as mostly black opposition to C.S. Lewis. Nature, in the sense that interests us, is simply another name for the physical universe, or the cosmos. Naturalism is therefore the thesis that there is nothing besides the physical universe. The physical universe is the sum total of all physical things. Naturalism is therefore the thesis that all things are physical things. Naturalism is therefore physicalism. We should certainly be very puzzled if someone said, I'm not a naturalist, but I'm a physicalist, or I'm not a physicalist, but I'm a naturalist. But this is of very little help, for it merely replaces the question, what does natural mean, with the question, what does physical mean? The word physical has come a very long way from its archaic Greek genesis in the growth of plants. It might even be said that the Latin word natura was invented to be the Latin translation of the Greek word physis, that the old French word nature was invented to be the old French translation of natura, and that the English word nature was invented to be the English translation of nature. It might be said, therefore, that natural and physical were synonyms. If it were said, it would not be quite true. For example, a pious Roman Catholic and a hard-headed atheist disputing about the implications of a supposed healing at Lourdes will agree that if a malignant tumor really vanished overnight, its vanishing was a physical event, but will disagree about whether it was a natural event. I should think that what this shows is that when the adjectives physical and natural are applied to events, the former application pertains to their constituents and the latter to their causes. Still, the words are close enough in meaning that if we are going to use physical to define naturalism, use the word physical to define the word naturalism, we shall have to take care to make sure that our definitions are not circular. What shall we say, then, about the meaning of physical? Well, the word, in the sense that is of present interest, obviously has something to do with the science of physics. If we were satisfied with the current state of physics, of standard working physics, we could define physical in the following way. There are two fundamental kinds of physical entities, space-time and elementary particles. Now, for present purposes, I'm going to ignore the fact that according to quantum field theory, it is quantum fields rather than particles that are the fundamental constituents of physical reality. My excuse for this simplification is that nothing I say is going to depend on it. A physical thing, then, is either space-time or some part of space-time or an elementary particle or something composed of elementary particles. But no one is, in fact, satisfied with the current state of physics, which is in which physics is a composite of the general theory of relativity and the so-called standard model. One very good reason for this is that the general theory of relativity and the standard model are inconsistent with each other, although in most situations that physicists are concerned to study, the inconsistency can be walled off and ignored. The second reason is that while the general theory of relativity is beautifully plausible, the standard model, for all its effectiveness, contains much unlovely arbitrariness. It is hoped that one day physics will be a unified and beautiful whole, that the science of physics will be coextensive with a single theory that explains both gravity, the present business of the standard model, and everything, the present business of general relativity, and everything else, the present business of the standard model. But it's generally conceded that the ontology of this dreamt-of final theory will almost certainly be very unlike the ontologies of general relativity in the standard model. Perhaps there will in the end be no space-time, but only particles, or something analogous to particles. Maybe they won't be point-line. Or perhaps there will be no particles, but only space-time, particles being reduced to singularities in space-time. Or perhaps there will be neither, but some third kind of thing, a kind of which we do not at present have a clear picture. However this may be, most people would agree that we cannot plausibly define physical by reference to the ontologies of the two components of present-day physics. What, then, are we to do if we wish to define physical? Well, most thinkers who have tried to answer this question would say something like this. We must abstract from the physics we know its essential core, something that, because it is essential to physics, will survive any future transformation of physics. We can do this, and when we have done it, we shall not have something so abstract and general as to be philosophically uninteresting. We shall have a really interesting concept, and it will reveal to us the essence of, or allow us plausibly to define, the physical, and hence the natural, and hence naturalism. Well, attempts at abstracting the essential core of present-day physics have been of two kinds, epistemological and ontological. The former finds the essence of physics in an unchanging method, although, the proponents of the epistemological attempt say, the physics of the future will no doubt employ concepts very different from those of the present day. Physicists will always use the same methods in their investigation, and these methods will one day lead them to a final theory, and that final theory will be a physical theory, as opposed to something that grew out of physics, but is not physics, as experimental psychology grew out of philosophy, but is not philosophy. It will be a physical theory because it is historically continuous with the discipline now called physics, its continuity with present-day physics consisting precisely in the continued application of those unchanging methods of investigation. This final theory will postulate entities of certain sorts. It will assert their existence. We may therefore plausibly define physical things as things of the sorts that will be postulated by the final theory. Or, at any rate, we may define physical things as things that are composed of things of those sorts, for no doubt there are special contingent structures, human beings and stars, for example, whose existence will not be a consequence of the theory itself, although their existence may be a consequence of the theory together with certain boundary conditions. Naturalism or physicalism may be defined as the thesis that there exist only things of the sorts that will be postulated by the final theory, or else things composed of those things. Now, I don't know what to say about this suggestion, other than to voice some suspicion. After all, I'm not a philosopher of physics, much less a physicist. I know little of these matters. But my unschooled suspicions are these. I suspect that there may be no such thing as the unchanging methods of investigation in physics that the definition depends on. And I suspect that if there are such methods, human beings, even given world enough and time, may not be capable of using them to reach a final theory. Who knows? Maybe they will be competing candidates for the office final theory, such that the unchanging methods of investigation will tell physicists that one could choose between these candidates only by performing an experiment that would require a linear accelerator 1,000 light years long. I don't know what others would say about this, but for my part, I should not want the validity of the account of naturalism I endorsed to depend on the assumption that the suspicions I have voiced are ungrounded. The ontological approach seems to me to be more promising. When we examine the properties of the theoretical entities of physics, we found that the following things can be said about certain of these properties with such assurance that it seems reasonable to suppose that any possible future physics will postulate only entities that have these properties. First, whatever the new panpsychists may try to tell us, nothing in the nature of these entities has anything to do with the mental. Nothing in their nature pertains to personality, consciousness, or intentionality. Human persons and all other entities that are conscious or have intentional states are complex, special, physically contingent structures composed of the fundamental entities postulated by physics. The mental properties of these complex structures must supervene on the properties of the entities physics postulates, of course, but those entities themselves do not have the least tincture of the mental about them. Just as the theoretical entities are not in any way alive, although all living things are ultimately composed of them, they in no way think or feel. The theoretical entities of physics, moreover, have no teleological properties. Even if certain complex structures entirely composed of these entities have ends or purposes or functions, for example, even if the function of hearts is to pump blood, or the function of warehouses is to house or to provide space to house equipment and inventory, teleology is in no way present in the theoretical entities that are the ultimate parts of these structures. Finally, these properties are numerically quantifiable. If, for example, the theoretical entities, just for the sake of an example, have mass and charge, one entity may have twice the mass or 1/2 the charge of another. And what applies to these the properties of these entities applies mutatis mutandis to the relations that they bear to one another. If, for example, one entity is separated from another by a certain space-time interval, a relation that may or may not actually figure in future physics, well, there's nothing mental or teleological about space-time intervals, and they have numerical measures, or at least measures that can be defined in terms of numbers. Physicalism or naturalism may now be defined, and this is not quite the words I'm using here at the top of the handout. Nothing exists but A, entities having such properties, that is, non-mental, non-teleological, numerically quantifiable properties, and bearing such relations, non-mental, non-teleological, numerically quantified relations to one another, and B, composite objects that have these entities as their ultimate parts. Some among the mereological sums of these entities may have mental or teleological and non-quantifiable properties. Whether they have such properties or not, their properties, all of the properties of the composite entities, all their properties supervene on the properties of the entities that are their ultimate parts and the relations these ultimate parts bear to one another. The distribution of properties in any world, in any possible world, depends on the distribution of properties among the simple or ultimate entities. As a matter of metaphysical necessity, two worlds that are alike in respect of the properties of and relations among their ultimate entities are perfect duplicates. According to naturalism, the truth of what is expressed by any of the following sentences, supposing them to express truths, supervenes on the non-mental, non-teleological, numerically quantifiable properties of, and the non-mental, non-teleological, numerically quantifiable relations that hold among the ultimate or simple entities. These sentences are reproduced on the handout. The first is a sentence that a city that is a perfect duplicate of Tokyo is the capital of a nation that is a perfect duplicate of Japan. Now, in the remaining illustrative sentences, I'm going to abandon the metaphysical scruples that have led me here to speak of perfect duplicates. The second illustrative sentence is, Taylor Swift's favorite color is purple. And it is wrong to bear false witness against one's neighbor. And there are at least 500,000 species of beetle. It's easier for a German to learn Dutch than it is for an Italian. In the 2020s, some astrophysicists began to doubt the existence of dark matter. All right. Now, there's one issue that divides naturalists that I will simply note. Some naturalists are unhappy about affirming the real existence of platonic or abstract entities, such as properties and propositions and mathematical objects like numbers and functions and tensors, and some are not. Rather than take sides in this dispute, I will simply insert one additional word into my statement of naturalism. Nothing concrete exists but the ultimate, the simple entities of physics and their composites. This is naturalism simpliciter. We may then say that there are two schools of naturalism, anti-Platonic naturalism, which insists that there are no Platonic entities, and the more liberal school, which simply does not worry about Platonic entities, which after all have no causal powers, and happily allows quantification over them. One might, of course, worry about what the opposed pair of terms concrete and abstract mean, but this is a problem that confronts everyone with ontological interests, and there is no reason to suppose that a naturalist and a non-naturalist, or an anti-naturalist and a liberal naturalist, an anti-Platonic naturalist and a liberal naturalist, would disagree about the merits of any proposed way of making the abstract concrete distinction clear. In the remainder of this talk, I'm going to address a series of questions about the relation of naturalism to various other topics and ideas. The first of these questions pertains to the ontology of the mental, and in particular, to the metaphysics of mental states and the question of what naturalists should say about the mental. Now, philosophers of mind, a category to which I most assuredly do not belong, are always talking about mental states. But what are they? For that matter, what is a state? Any sort of state, mental or physical. This is not a question that philosophers of mind are generally quick to answer. When I've tried to persuade philosophers of mind to answer it, I've got a variety of results, but I have never got an answer. Some of the philosophers of mind do not respond at all. Some respond with words that don't seem to mean much, like, well, the term is defined functionally. You have to immerse yourself in exchanges in which it occurs. Some respond with derision. I see we have with us today a representative of the sterile scholasticism characteristic of metaphysicians. Some respond with accusations of disingenuousness. You know perfectly well what mental state means. You're just pretending not to understand. But if there is nothing but, on the one hand, sums of fundamental physical entities, and on the other, abstract Platonic entities, what is there for mental states to be but some among the abstract Platonic entities, to wit, the ones variously called properties or qualities or attributes. What is there for my physical state at T to be, if not the conjunction of all the physical properties I have at T? What is there for my mental state at T to be, if not the conjunction of all the mental properties I have at T? What could mental states be if not properties? They're certainly not sums of fundamental physical entities, are they? Not objects like the persons or beasts whose mental states they are. If naturalism is true, a thing belongs to the metaphysical category substance, if and only if it's a sum of the fundamental physical entities. That can't be right, says the interlocutor, because if it were right, then mental states would exist necessarily. They'd exist no matter what. They'd exist in possible worlds in which nothing is sapient and nothing is sentient. They'd exist in all possible worlds, and they'd exist at all times. Consider the mental state of some English soldier at some moment during the Battle of Culloden, a complex mixture of fear, excitement, calculation, and all manner of desires and beliefs. The desire to avoid being killed here on this field of Culloden, for example, and the belief that he had been born early in the 18th century. If mental states are, as you suppose, universalia ante res, that momentary mental state exists now just as surely as it existed in 1745, and it already existed when dinosaurs roamed the earth. End of interlocutor's outburst. Well, I have no reply to this imaginary objection other than to repeat myself. I don't know what a state, mental or physical, could possibly be if it were not a property. And I don't see how a property can possibly avoid being a necessarily existent thing. Now, here's one of these difficult little passages, and it's summarized on the handout. Suppose that there is a possible world W in which a certain property does not exist, the property being cubical, let us say. If that property does not exist in W, then it's hard to see how propositions about cubes, for example, the proposition that there are cubes, or the proposition that it's possible for there to be cubes, could exist in W. And if it is possible in W for there to be cubes, it's hard to see how it could fail to be the case that the proposition that it is possible for there to be cubes could be anything other than true in W. And it follows that if the attribute being cubical does not exist in W, then it's not possible in W for there to be cubes. And from that, it follows that the actual world, which is well endowed with cubes, is not a possible world in W. But W is a possible world according to the actual world, so then the accessibility relation is not symmetrical. And this very situation in which we find ourselves might have been not only not possible, not actual, but not possible. I find it a lot easier to believe that attributes are necessarily existent than I do to believe that this actual state of affairs might not have been possible. Now, I am myself very far indeed from being a naturalist, but I agree with most things that naturalists believe about us human beings and the world about us. In one manner, I may perhaps be more a naturalist about human beings than most naturalists. I deny that there are entities that are in any way parts or constituents of human beings, or that inhere in human beings other than physical entities. I'll try to explain the way I see this matter by means of an example. Suppose that Sally is a dedicated Buddhist, and that she has achieved the no-mind state. She is literally thinking no thoughts and having no experiences. But the no-mind state is even harder to persist in than it is to achieve, and it ends, and Sally suddenly finds herself entertaining an elaborate visual memory of her 4-year-old daughter romping in a field of daisies. I maintain that nothing came into existence at this point. There are no visual memories, no mental images, experiences, sensations, perceptions, sense data, or qualia. There are indeed mental properties, but they are not what property dualists call mental properties. What I am calling mental properties are as abstract and bloodless as the Riemann zeta function. Such attributes as is thinking of Vienna, or it tends carefully to the orange afterimage of the camera flash, or desperately wishes to gain her father's approval, are eternal, necessarily existent, and without causal powers. The same, of course, is true of physical properties. Being made entirely of glass, having a mass of 70 kilograms, and being hot enough to scorch paper are necessarily existent and without causal powers. Being hot enough to scorch paper doesn't have causal powers. It is the causal power, but it doesn't have causal powers, nor does it contribute to the causal powers of the things that have it. A poker just out of the fire is not hot enough to scorch paper because it has the property being hot enough to scorch paper. Rather, it has the property being hot enough to scorch paper because it is hot enough to scorch paper. When Sally emerged from the no-mind state and resumed thinking and feeling, I have said, nothing thereby came into existence. She, of course, began once more to have mental properties, but the mental properties she began to acquire had always existed. If she suddenly had the thought, a little girl in a white cotton dress is a lovely thing, that thought was a thought that I suspect thousands of other people have had. It is what Frege calls a gedanke, and what I generally call a proposition. It is a thought in the sense the words have in the expression two minds with but a single thought, and in the title, The Thoughts of Chairman Mao. But then, what are the property dualists' non-physical properties? What are the ethical intuitionists' non-natural properties? I once pressed David Chalmers on the question of what the phrase non-physical property meant. And that isn't a question that has an obvious answer. Non-physical property doesn't mean property that isn't a physical thing, or all properties would be non-physical properties. It doesn't mean property that can only be had by non-physical things, or property dualism would entail that only non-physical things can think and feel. That is, assuming that there are both thinking things and material things. Property dualism would entail substance dualism, the disavowal of which is one of the primary reasons for being a property dualist. Now, Chalmers' answer to this difficult question was, I think, the only possible answer. This is some of the following material is summarized on the handout. He suggested that we base our definition of non-physical property on some set of paradigmatic physical properties or kinds of physical properties, perhaps those that can be built up mathematically, starting with displacement, duration, mass, charge, and even the more recondite dimensions, as they're called in physics, that figure principally in calculations that pertain to goings-on inside the nucleus. Let us call the properties that can be so specified the basics. In what follows, I allow for the possibility that the properties that are the basics in one possible world are not the basics in another. All right, then, say that two worlds that have the same basics are basically similar. So if mass and charge are the basics in the actual world, then the actual world is basically similar to those and only those worlds in which mass and charge are the basics. And we say that a property is physical in the world W, just in the case that it is distributed in the same way in W and some other world W prime, if W and W prime are basically similar, and the basics are distributed in the same way in W and W prime. That is, a property is physical in the world if it supervenes on the basics in that world. And a property is non-physical in W if it is not physical, but it is possibly true in W that it is a property of physical things. So, for example, the property thinking about gravity is a non-physical property in the actual world if Einstein was a physical thing, and there is a possible world that is basically similar to the actual world, in which the basics are distributed just as they are in the actual world, and Einstein is a zombie. A world just like this one, but Einstein, at any rate, is complete blank on the inside. Now, an obvious consequence of naturalism, this is on the handout, this is an obvious consequence of naturalism. Two worlds are alike in every respect, two worlds that are alike in respect of the properties of and relations among their element entities are alike in every respect. So you have the elementary particles, say, in space-time, if those are the element entities, if two worlds are the other world, things are distributed in space-time in exactly the same way, then those worlds are alike in every respect. And the following two principles seem, I would say, I'm not endorsing them, I'm saying it's a consequence of naturalism. The following principles seem plausible. These two are on the handout. If W and W prime are two basically similar worlds in which the basics are distributed in the same way, then W and W prime are alike in respect to the properties of and relations among their ultimate entities. And if there are properties that are distributed differently in W and W prime, then W and W prime are not alike in every respect. If those two principles are true, then naturalism entails that there are no non-physical properties. Okay, well, that's not a very surprising thesis. I mention it to contrast the non-physical properties of the property dualists with the non-natural properties of the ethical evolutionists. I think it is fair to say that although G.E. Moore never used the word supervene or any of its grammatical variants, he was the inventor of the concept of supervenience. In The Conception of Intrinsic Value, he maintained that non-natural properties like goodness and beauty, when they belong to natural things like a human being or a golden ring, are not independent of the natural properties of those things. For example, if a golden ring is a beautiful object, then any ring of the same size, shape, mass, color, density, texture, and so on, and let's not pause over the question of what and so on comes to, any ring with those properties must also be beautiful. A perfect physical duplicate of a beautiful ring has to be a beautiful ring too. It seems then that there is an interesting contrast to be drawn between the non-physical properties that figure in Chalmers's metaphysic of mind and the non-natural properties that figure in Moore's metaphysic of value. It indeed seems, well, natural to say that physical property and natural property are, as the history of the word natural would suggest, two names for the same class of properties. But that can't be right. Non-physical property, the phrase non-physical property, by definition, applies to properties that do not supervene on natural properties. And if the words non-natural property do not by definition apply only to properties that supervene on natural properties, the thesis that they apply only to such properties is nevertheless an important component of the metaphysic of value in which those properties figure. My own reaction to this contrast is one that I recommend to all naturalists. It is this: although naturalists should regard property dualism as inconsistent with naturalism, they should concede that they understand the notion. property dualists maintain, very roughly speaking, the pattern of instantiation of mental properties by physical things is not metaphysically necessitated by the laws of nature and the distribution of matter and radiation in space-time. And for that reason, the term non-physical is applied to mental properties, because according to the property dualists, they don't supervene on the distribution of matter and radiation in space-time. But according to Moore, non-natural properties like goodness and beauty do supervene on distribution of matter and radiation in space-time. Admittedly, he wouldn't quite put it that way, but I don't think that misrepresents him. But then, in virtue of what are these non-natural properties if they supervene on natural properties? We may well ask. Now I want to turn from properties to substances, the things with causal powers. In the sequel, I'll call them beings. Naturalists, of course, deny that there are beings that are in any sense outside nature. But they have been, as a group, particularly concerned to deny the existence of beings that are not simply outside nature, but are also above nature, to deny the existence of supernatural beings. The rest of this talk will be about the concept of the supernatural and the kinds of things that can properly be described as supernatural. In common parlance, I suppose, the word supernatural is used in matters pertaining to beings of the sort one encounters in horror movies, ghosts, vampires, werewolves, and so on. But these are not supernatural beings. That is, they are not unreal or fictional supernatural beings. They are rather natural beings, or would be if they were real. But suppose someone says, look, vampires at all are not merely things that aren't real, like Wells's Martians. They are things that couldn't be real. They couldn't be real because their real existence would be contrary to the laws of nature. And that's precisely why we call them supernatural beings. The interlocutor is certainly right to say that the real existence of ghosts and werewolves and such wouldn't be contrary to the laws of nature, but that doesn't justify applying the term supernatural to them. Giants, for example, are forever consigned to myth and legend by the square cube law, and centaurs cannot exist because their human mouths and nostrils and lungs would not be able to process the amount of oxygen needed to maintain the metabolic processes of those huge organisms. And no one would say that a giant or a centaur was a supernatural being. The denizens of horror movies are not the only creatures that are not supernatural beings. For instance, the gods of the ancient Mediterranean and Mesopotamian worlds are not supernatural beings. I do see the sign. You remember we started sometime after the hour. What then would a supernatural being be? Well, I want to make just well, I do have a bit more to say, and I was told that the time I was to speak from between 45 minutes and an hour. I have spoken for just over 40 minutes now. What would a supernatural being be? Well, to make a start, a being that is not a part of the physical world and shares no part with the physical world, a being whose genesis is not within the natural world and whose nature owes nothing to the natural world. But to say only that much is to provide only a definition of a non-natural being. The definition of supernatural being requires one more clause. A supernatural being is in some way the ground or source of the being and nature of the natural world. Two obvious examples are God and the Neoplatonic One. One might wonder whether any lesser supernatural beings than these two were possible. God is an ontological center. The existence and nature of everything else depends on him. The One is an ontological center. The existence and nature of everything else depends on it. God is a personal ontological center. The One is an impersonal ontological center. One wonders, though, whether there could be lesser supernatural beings than God or the One. That is, could there be supernatural beings that were created or which otherwise owe their existence to other supernatural beings? They wouldn't be ontological centers. So I'd call them uncentered supernatural beings. And I want to give just one example of a possible uncentered supernatural being. Or at least I'll give an example of what I'm about to say is meaningful at all. It depends on the so-called simulation hypothesis, that we're all living in a simulation of a world, sort of like in the Matrix, but without even the physical beings that figure, the physical brains that figure in the Matrix. It's quite a possible, quite a plausible, it's quite a popular theory in some quarters these days. I don't really understand it because I reject two theses in the philosophy of language that are written at the bottom of your handout here. And that is, suppose that we're living in a simulation, then it would be possible for the people conducting the simulation and us to have a common language. And secondly, the certain natural language words and phrases do not fail of reference. Words and phrases like the English words and phrases, the physical universe, the laws of nature, matter, radiation, the earth, you, I, Vladimir Putin. As long as you accept those two, then the example will go through. And so suppose one day a woman appears, a strange woman comes to see you, and she tells you that you're living in a computer simulation, and that she, that is, she whose avatar is speaking to you, is one of the people who constructed the simulation. When you express skepticism, she pulls a pen from your shirt pocket and says, "Let this pen turn to chocolate." And it does. And while munching on your former pen, you'll watch while she turns the sun green, transforms the oak in your front yard into a Tolkien-style ent, and gives wings and the power of flight to your astonished cat. If she is one of the people who constructed the simulation, she can do all these things, just a matter of rewriting some code. She can do these miraculous things, these literally miraculous things, for what she is doing is setting aside the laws of nature at a whim. Why not? She wrote the code that established the laws of nature, and she can change it. It seems, therefore, that the creators of the computer simulation are the creators of what we call, and correctly call, the physical universe. They are the authors of nature. It exists because it's their will that it should exist. It continues to exist from one moment to the next only because it's their will. The laws of nature, the laws they have designed and imposed upon nature, continue to be laws from moment to moment only because that is their pleasure. Well, there's a lot more that could be said on this topic. If I were to go on, I might point out some important differences between them and Descartes' genius malignus and its great deception on the other differences. But I think we must make an end somewhere, so let's make an end here. Thank you.
Thank you for that very thought-provoking and interesting presentation.